Gold is at an all-time high, and usually when we hit something like this, we kind of come back to this question: why aren't we on the gold standard? Isn't that something that would have more stability, less inflation, and just make things a whole lot easier for all of us in terms of the US economy, trade, and everything in between? When you look at the history, it sounds good until you start to look at it a bit deeper. So how do we get off the gold standard, and why is that the case? Let's go ahead and break it down. Let's first start off with what the gold standard was. Basically, you had to have an amount of gold stored in the basement for every $1 that you produced. And originally, like in the 1930s or so, every brick of gold that you had was worth about 40 cents. And that was it. You can't print more gold than you have dollars, or the other way around. You can't have more dollars printed than you have gold, because you can't print gold. And that's the point. That right there is the point. You can't just be out here printing gold, taking on debt, do all this crazy stuff, because you ain't got the gold to do it. That is the whole purpose. And for some people, that is pretty comforting, because you can't have runaway US debt. But then 1933 happened. That is when we ran into the Great Depression, and people hoarded gold. We ran into a gold shortage, and people say, look, I'm holding on to everything. And when you don't have gold out there, you can't print money. What do? That is what the US did in 1933, and they got off the gold standard for domestic production, or domestic trade rather. It wasn't until 1971 that we got off the gold standard altogether, which means internationally as well. It didn't work. For example, yes, gold, it helps to build some stability when you know how much gold there is, and there is a lot of gold in the United States, except that it can add a bit of instability and inflation if you find a sum of gold out of nowhere, right? You're adding a bunch of extra money into the system. For example, when we added Alaska as a state, right? That did happen, and there's a lot of gold in Alaska that added a lot of inflation, a whole bunch of gold, and it threw things off for just a bit, and that can happen in different pockets of the world. Also, is that how you want to run the world economy, based on the fact that some spots of the earth just have more gold than others, and that's just it? It's just based on that. There's a pocket somewhere in Wakanda that just has more gold, and that just because of where those borders sit, they're just wealthier, and that's just where things run. And that's it. And everybody just continuously drills, and that's how wealthy nations become wealthy. Literally just by drilling and looking in the dirt all the time. And that's just what we do. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best system that we should have, but I understand the sentiment. But here is the other part of it. While it may make sense on paper that 1 ounce of gold equals 40 cents of a paper dollar, or what have you, or one bar of gold equals $1, that's not actually how it works in practice, because that ratio has to be controlled by somebody. In some cases it could be Congress, some cases it could be the Federal Reserve, or whatever. That part does change. In the United States, for example, that ratio was suspended in the case of war. Also, in other cases, that is how inflation can happen, because that ratio can change over time, because the value of gold changes over time. For example, it can be 1 ounce for $20 for a period of time. It can be 1 ounce for every $30, and that's something that can start to cause inflation or cause things to change in ways that you might not expect. So you could say, okay, well look, there's a set amount of gold, but while it's 1-to-1 now, all of a sudden it's 1-to-20, 1-to-30, 1-to-40, and things are becoming worth less or worth more if I all of a sudden flip that and say, well, now it is worth just half a dollar, right? It is now worth 60 cents. It's now worth just a penny, right? And your gold is worth much less. So that is one way how things can be manipulated, even though you still have the exact same amount of gold. It is essentially the same way that you could argue Bitcoin is done in some ways. There's a set amount of coins out there that's not going to be made. There won't be any more, but the price of Bitcoin continuously moves, right? I know they're being slowly mined and all kind of stuff, but there's only but so many Bitcoins. The price keeps moving, and because there is a limited supply, people keep buying. that is one example, and that's why some people find Bitcoin to be valuable. But again, Bitcoin and gold may not be the best one-to-one comparison. Because of those pros and cons is why we move to what is called the fiat system, where that dollar that you have is based on not gold or anything physical. It's just based on trust. Trust in whatever government is printed on the face of that dollar. Now, in the U.S., it's the U.S. dollar, and the value of that trust has been dropping. Now, that's not an opinion. That is a fact. We saw in the first half of this year, the value of the U.S. dollar compared to other currencies has dropped by a record amount. I think it was, I'll put the exact stat here. I don't know if it was by the most amount since the 1970s or whatever it was. Again, stat here, you can look at it, all right? Okay, that's a fact, and that's because the U.S. has been doing some stuff that has been untrustworthy. Again, that's a fact. That's a fact. Now, same thing with Canada, same thing with the European Union, and any country, just based on, do we trust you or not? I can go and get, I don't know if I can go and get, if I had a North Korean dollar right now, you're not going to trust me. And if I paid you North Korean dollar right now, you can be like, whatever, dog. Like, this might as well be monopoly money. If I paid you in Canadian dollars, you could go to a bank and get that exchange and do something with that, right? Same thing with European dollars and vice versa. We trust some countries better than others based on how they pay their bills, how trustworthy is their central bank. In the U.S., it is the Federal Reserve, so on and so forth. And are those things independent? What I mean by independent is it's not lawmakers, it's not Congress that just sits there and makes the decisions. It's certainly not the president of those respective countries sitting there making those decisions all the time. I want interest rates to be higher, I want them to be lower, and they just flip a switch and do it. They're making those decisions, it's supposed to be making those decisions on their own. That helps to garner that trust. And the reason why is because you don't want them printing too much money, taking on too much debt, and vice versa. Though, yes, the Fed here in the US, they're not the ones taking on the debt, it's the Congress, so on and so forth. But you guys are getting the point. You want them to manage that money the best way possible. Now, we can argue on whether the US is doing that correctly or not. There are that's a whole different video, but that is where we are currently on the fiat system, and most modern economies are on that fiat system. I can't name any governments off the top of my head that are still on the gold system, but that is why we moved there. Gold shortage, it really doesn't make that much sense that we just base our system on that one piece of rock in the earth. Why not silver? Silver is cool. Why not why not metal? Why not platinum? Right? Why just those? Why just gold? We just decided to do that one. And when you run out, right, or you found all you think you found, things can dry up very, very quickly. So this is perhaps the best system that we currently have. We'll see if and when there is a system beyond this. Maybe that is crypto, and we're seeing whether or not that experiment is going to work long term. Today, it feels like a very good one. We'll see, right? There have been periods in time where that hadn't felt all that great. So you guys asked the question, that is the answer. If you have other questions, feel free to drop those in the comments. I have other Q&As right here on the screen, so make sure you check those out as well.